Hi, everyone. We're running a little bit over, so in case everyone isn't here in the next hour 45, and maybe it's a great chat and everyone wants to stay longer, I'm just going to give you a little bit of our notes for tonight, if that's fine. We've decided to do it before rather than at the end. So the dinner is at the Two Oceans Aquarium tonight. Absolutely stunning venue with all the marine life. We're going to be there from 7 p.m. So we're going to meet, if you're staying at the Breakwater large hotel, in B block foyer. We're going to meet there at 10 to 7, and we're all going to walk across together. Alternatively, all our DPRU people will be stationed along the walk. It's very simple. It's across the road in this direction. It's a couple of minutes away. Anyone at the hotel can help you. We can also direct you, but we'll be in B block foyer at 10 to 7 if you want to walk together. That's what I have to say.
This is really difficult. I think I've given talks or hosted sessions before lunch or before dinner, but never before penguins. So it's I'm not sure we can compete with this. Thank you so much, Kezia. Thanks so much, Haroon, and the organizers. My name is Christian Meyer. I'm at the University of Oxford. I'm not going to take much more time from this session because I want to get right to our speakers. But I did want to say 2 words about, what the heck are these Oxford people doing here? Why is this? How does this all fit together? And the point is that I am the director at Oxford of a research program called the Oxford Martin Program, The Future of Development. And at this research program, we're quite interested to think about livelihoods in low and middle income countries and how these livelihoods are changing. And we're trying to get a better sense from various angles and through various lenses on what that means for sort of development trajectories and for people and for firms in low and middle income countries. One way in which livelihoods will change certainly is through decarbonization. For sure, decarbonization, efforts to decarbonize our economies will impact livelihoods around the world in rich countries and poorer countries. And there's lots of policy discussion around this concept of a just transition, a just green energy transition. South Africa is one of the key countries where this is an important policy issue. I'm just taking this here from the ILO website. What does the just transition mean? Well, it could be described as a green energy transition that maximizes the social and economic opportunities of climate action. Very vague, very broad, intentionally very broad. What this session here aims to do is to try and be a conversation starter for academic economists like us, labor economists, development economists working in this space, to think about what this means for an academic economist. How will this green energy transition, these decarbonization efforts impact employment, skills demand, and earnings inequality? There's obviously a large literature going all the way back to Tinbergen on, wage inequality, polarization. There's more recent work, David Otter, Derna Sumoglu, polarization, you know the vast literature. I don't need to talk to you about this. The vast literature around skill-biased technological change here. Are we thinking about the same types of issues here with decarbonization? Some of these might be the same, some issues might be the same, some might be different. What are the implications for the creation of new jobs? Where will these new jobs be created? When will they be created? There's going to be presumably a bunch of mismatches in that where and when between the destruction and the creation of new jobs. What is the role of labor market intermediaries in overcoming frictions in these transitions? We all know about the frictions that abound, especially in low and middle income country labor markets. It makes it even more important for a labor market intermediary to step up. We also know that the green energy transition in many ways is different from the sort of, you know, automation and digitalization, because we're going to make conscious decisions to turn off parts of the economy. We as a, you know, society, social contract will come to a decision to say turn off coal power plants in South Africa. And so that is somewhat different from this more diffuse, you know, sense of, oh, automation and machines, and it's going to happen anyway. What are then the implications for social protection systems, how to best design them, how to deliver human capital for this? And importantly, how do we tackle these types of questions in more data constrained environments where we don't have, you know, burning glass online vacancy data to understand what the labor market is doing? So this session here, we as this Oxford program, we hope to bring together a couple of different economists that look at these types of issues from different angles. I think we have a really, really cool lineup. We'll have Francesco, who's going to start with some empirical work, mostly focused on high-income countries. Then we'll have Stefanos with some really interesting, I think, theoretical, conceptual framework for us to think about this. And then Margaret wrapping this up with sort of a bit more of a policy insight, pulling on some of her work or drawing in some of her work that she's been doing in the policy space around this issue. So these three different speakers are meant to sort of, you know, be brain teasers in a way and sort of conversation starters. I'll also say as a last thing, we work with Haroon's group at DPRU. Our program in Oxford works with Haroon's group to try and tackle some of these issues in the context of South Africa, thinking about the coal value chain specifically, and the types of jobs and the numbers of jobs that will be impacted. But more generally, over the next few years, our program at Oxford, we're hoping to be a bit of a convening place for more sort of academic work in this space. So if you're interested in this space, if you think about other contexts where it'd be interesting to do research on this, you know, the experiences of decarbonization will vary across the world. Come and see us, come and see me, we can chat. Find the speakers here. I'm hoping that this can really be the starting point for a little bit of a community of practice of academics working on these types of issues. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Francesco, who has done some really cool work on these types of questions, mostly in high-income countries, to start us off with some really interesting work. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for the nice introduction, Christian. And so today I'm gonna give you a broad overview, I would say, of the measurement issue to capture the impact of decarbonization on the labor market. I am Francesco Vona, I'm professor at the University of Milan, and I coordinate a group on these topics at the Fondazione Enrico Mattei, where we have you know, quite a big group working exactly on these issues. So today my starting point is to try to convince you of which are the right measures I speak like this, okay. Thanks. On which are the right, which is the right measurement framework to capture the labor market implication of the green transition. And I want to be clear on one point here, that as Christian said, what we are meaning by looking at the decarbonization effort is something that has to do with the mitigation policies. Okay, so actually mitigation policies is something that is the mainstream in a way in developed countries, but is not the mainstream in developing countries. Okay, so actually all what I'm saying here perhaps will be a talk of the past very soon, if soon we will need to accept that only adaptation is the solution to climate change. Okay, I hope not, but it can be. Or perhaps nuclear fusion that will solve all the problems. So actually, I'm going to start with a very quick introduction, where I give you the main message of my talk. In the case I'm not gonna, with 100% probability, I'm not gonna finish. And then I will discuss, let's say, new way to measure green employment and the notion of green employment, and then I will move to some application of this measure of green employment to measures of green skills and estimation of the green wage premium. And then I will gonna talk about a measure of instead of brown employment, that is the carbon content. So as you know, the debate in developed countries on the green transition is very polarized, from the job killing argument to the fact that, as Biden says, when I hear climate, I think about jobs, high paying union jobs. So this polarization, as especially in the US, often obscure the key challenges for policymakers. And obviously the key challenges are already, has been already mentioned by Christians, who are the winners and losers, how to ensure a just transition for worker and region left behind by climate policies. Here, my notion of just transition is a bit different from the one of the ILO, and how to favor a smooth labor reallocation toward green jobs, and especially which skills and retraining policies are important to this. Okay. One first starting point to identify the winners and losers is to avoid all the confusion that usually surround the concept of green jobs. And the confusion emerged especially because there is no one definition of green jobs that we should use. We should use two definitions of green jobs. The first one is the intuitive one. I mean, what is green or inverse green is what is brown in a way, is the direct pollution content of an occupation. So if an occupation is more involved in carbon intensive or highly polluted production processes, is more relatively more carbon intensive or more brown than another occupation. Okay? So that's the first definition. Then there is a second definition that instead is what we call green. And actually, this is more related to the technological side. So these are the occupations and tasks that are involved in activities that reduce environmental impact. So for instance, a wind turbine technician is an occupation that have a high carbon content, but when you produce a wind turbine, you more than offset the high carbon content of the wind turbine because you are going to produce clean energy. Okay, so a green turbine technician is a brown occupation and a green occupation. Okay. And then there is what I call low carbon, sometimes during the presentation, is a subset of technologies that are for decarbonization. I mean, decarbonization is not the only environmental goal of our society, obviously. The main point of my talk, and I hope I will be convincing on this, is that you need two notions of green jobs to capture all the aspects of the green transition. You need a notion of brown, you need a notion of green. Why? Because, for instance, the policy effect will be mostly on the job destruction side on brown jobs, of course, and this will be mostly the effect of carbon pricing policies or other environmental taxes, whereas on the green side, we will have the job creation effect that is mostly related to green subsidies and stuff like that. And these two sets of occupation, except for the wind turbine technician, which is a distinct exception, they are very different, okay? The sectors where they are involved is very different. They're mining, metal, cement for brown, utility construction, machinery, waste management for green, and the types of occupation are very different. Mining engineers, molders for brown, roofers, fuel cell technicians for green. Okay, so actually, let me start with my talk with the measuring of green jobs. Obviously, this is more problematic. Why is more problematic? Because there are no data on green jobs. I mean, standard occupational classification were simply not designed to capture green jobs, or better, standard occupational classification adapt the job titles with a substantial delay. Okay, so and actually these are more new occupations, and so it's normal that we cannot see them in the data. Okay? And obviously, not having good data on green jobs may twist the argument, the political debate toward the job killing argument, because we don't have good data on green jobs, we can only observe the job destruction effect. Okay? And so actually, how we solve this problem, we take advantage of the task-based model developed, pioneered by Autor, Levy, and Murnern, and then others, and we apply this to the green transition. Okay, so actually, let me be quick. We use the ONET database, and in the ONET database, there are two types of green jobs: existing jobs that will change because of the green transition, and new jobs, okay, like the wind jobs, okay? And in ONET, that is this occupational information network that is for the United States, there are around 100 over 1,000 occupations that are considered green according to this classification, okay? However, ONET contains also another piece of information that is much more useful than this simple binary type of information, which is the task content of the occupation. So you can imagine each occupation as a vector of task, okay? It's defined as a vector of task descriptors that for these two particular types of occupation is partitioned in two subvectors. The two subvectors are the subvector of green task and the subvector of non-green task. Let me give you some example. In the subvector of green task, for instance, there is climb wind turbine or remove asbestos. Okay, they're clearly green task. In the subvector of non-green task, there are stuff like participate in audit, inspect roofs to determine repairing procedures. Okay, and so using this information, you can build another measure of green jobs that is not anymore a binary measure. So you don't classify occupation as green or not in a 0-1 binary way, but you build a continuous measure of greenness, which is the share of green task over total task, and is a continuous indicator of the average time spent by this occupation on green task. Okay, obviously this is an average. For the entire US economy is not allowing to capture heterogeneous pattern across region. There is a lot of limitation, but as I will show you in 1 second, is much better than the other binary measure. So just to give you an example, here I'm just considering green enhanced occupation and green new and emerging occupation, and you see that occupation with greenness equal 1 are clearly green, like environmental engineer or recycling coordinator or wind stuff. Okay. Occupation with greenness between, let's say, 30% and 50% are clearly not completely green, like roofers or atmospheric scientists, okay? Or construction worker, in the binary definition, they will be considered fully green. Obviously, this is a very big mistake, because construction workers are also a big occupation. In the greenness classification, they have a greenness of around 0.09, so 9%, okay? So actually, I'm not saying that this is a very accurate and precise measure, but it's much better than the binary measure. So let me show you this by calculating two indexes of the green employment share. One using the binary measure, the other reweighting the share of employment of occupation that are green by the greenness that is a proxy of the share of time spent into green occupation. Okay, so actually using these two measures, I can plot the evolution of green employment shares in the United States. Here you don't see trends, but there are trends because the scale is very different. Okay, there are trends, and actually green employment is more pro-cyclical than non-green employment. But this is not the goal is not this one here. But my goal is instead looking at the differences in level. The difference in level is that the share of green employment using the binary definition is above 10%. Whereas the share of green employment using the task-based approach is around 3%, or even less, 2% if we only retain the core task, because ONET also distinguish between core and non-core task into the ONET classification. Okay, just to which one is right, which one is wrong? Well, there are data on green production in the US for 2010 and 2011. The share using this data of green production is around 2-3%. So either you are convinced that green production are 5 times more labor intensive than non-green production, which is not realistic, or this definition is much more accurate. Okay? So then we can compute also the share of the greenness by occupation, and we end up with 4 occupations that are the most green one: engineers and architects, life science, life and physical scientists, construction and extraction worker, installation, maintenance, and repairing worker. These are the 4 main green jobs. Okay. Well, the question is obviously what to do without ONET. So ONET is only available for the US. How we can solve the problem of not having ONET? So the first way of solving the problem is using direct data on green technologies. Okay, so we know from the task-based approach that the task composition depends on the technology you use. Okay, so if you don't have data on task, you can use data on technology. So actually, this is what we are trying to do with Europe, building a database of green production at a very, very disaggregated level. Okay, so then a very common practice has been the one of imputing ONET task measure to other occupational classification using crosswalks. Okay, this has been quite successful for the routine task intensity index. I thought about the work of Goose, Anna Salomons et al. But in this case, it's much more problematic. There are two problems here. One problem that you usually obviously know is the problem of assuming the same task content for different countries. This problem is minor for Europe and the US that have the similar technological level, but it's very big, as shown in several work of people, I think also present here of the World Bank, that is very problematic for developing countries. Okay, and the second problem is the main problem here, is the problem of aggregation. Okay, so usually labor force surveys have data that are much more aggregated than the US one. So when you are going to aggregate the data without having employment weights, you are going to overestimate by a very, very large amount the share of green employment. Okay, so you end up with share of green employment that are completely unrealistic. And this is problematic. Why? Because I want to recall you, the share of green employment is 2% of total employment. Okay, if green employment was bigger, the measurement error would be much smaller. Okay. So, and then there is a new frontier of job vacancy data, especially using burning gas data, and I will show you this is the most, according to me, the third and the first for me are the most promising way of proceeding. The second is not particularly fruitful in this case, and I will show you some data now on job vacancy data. Of course, there is a usual problem that low-skilled workers are underrepresented and is only capturing the demand side. Okay? Here we develop with other co-authors this kind of natural language processing algorithm to identify, using burning gas data, low carbon job ads. In the interest of time, I don't want to speak too much about this, but we also validate this classification using expert elicitations, and we end up with 445 low carbon job identifier, and then we redid what I did already using this data, also for the US, okay? And we found more or less the same stuff. So the share of here is only low carbon. Remember, before it was all green. What does it mean? All green include waste management, which is a big sector, okay? Here is low carbon, so if the share is smaller, it's around 1.5%, okay? And here we can also look at the share different by occupation, and how they evolve over time, okay? And also, if we look at which are the main green occupation, we found the same occupation, so architect and engineer, life and physical scientist, construction and extraction, and installation and maintenance. Plus, we found transportation and material moving. Why? Because we assume that bus drivers are basically green, okay? And all public transport is green. We can question this, there is no problem. I mean, okay, so I hope I convince you that, I mean, this job vacancy approach can be a good way of proceeding. I mean, at least for the US, we find a good matching. I mean, the data tell you more or less the same stuff. But I think that even more important than identifying green jobs is more important to identify green skills. So if you take seriously the task-based model, there is a key distinction between task and skills. So the task is the demand side that reflect the technological level. The skills are the capability to perform certain tasks, okay? And as you know, the skills are very important for several reasons. They are the drivers of innovation, they are the mediating factor of inequality, and even more important, the skill distance is the key variable that determines the success of a job-to-job transition. So if you want to take a worker that is a coal miner to employ him or her in the wind turbine sector, well, you have to know which skills, the distance of the skill set is the main variable that determine how much is going to be productive in the new job. Okay? And so it's very important to understand the skill biases of green technologies in general. And I want to stress one thing: you don't need necessarily to have data on task for this. It's just enough to have good data on technology. Okay, so if you have good data on green patents or green production, is enough to do what I'm going to present now. Okay. So actually, I already told you we take very seriously the distinction between task and skills, and just very small theoretical notation. In the task model, the assignment of skills to task depend on a revealed comparative advantage, and this revealed comparative advantage can be revealed by the data. Oh, sorry, on comparative advantage, and this comparative advantage can be revealed by the data, okay? Using a standard kind of hedonic approach, okay? So ONET provides a detailed catalog of general skills. So besides this vector of task that I told you, there is a huge vector of skills that is defined for all the occupations. So for instance, there is problem solving that is defined both for construction worker and for engineers. Engineers have a very high score of problem solving, and construction worker a low one. Okay, and this vector is very long. It's like 400 skills. Okay, so what we did is to search the skill that are relevant, the skill L that is relevant for occupation K, regressing the skill score on the greenness of occupation K. Okay, controlling for stock 3-digit dummies. Why we want to control for stock 3-digit dummies? We don't want to compare the skill set of a construction worker with the skill set of an engineer. We want to compare the skill set of a wind engineer with the skill set of a traditional engineer. Okay, otherwise the comparison is not apple with apple. Okay. So actually, doing this, we consider a green skills, a skill as green if this beta is statistically significant at 1% and positive, and we found 16 green general skills. Then we found 16 too many, and so what we did is to use principal component analysis to rank and group them, okay? And this has come out very nicely because the ranking and the grouping was very, very consistent with what we would expect. So we found these 4 green skills that are engineering and technical, these 6 are inside this group. This is the most important one that explains up to 40% of the variation in the data. Then we have operation management, the second one that are, managerial skill, more practical, monitoring, like evaluating information that determines competence with standards, and science. So these are the 4 green skills. So now I just talk about these 4 green skills rather than talking about each single item. Okay? So actually, the interesting thing is the first question is to say, well, which type of information, additional information these green skills gives to us compared to standard human capital measure, okay? And actually, this is very interesting because if you consider the second, operation management, the third, monitoring, and the fourth, green skill, science, they are very nicely correlated, for instance, with the routine task intensity index. What does it mean? They don't have a lot in terms of information compared to the routine task intensity index. However, the most important green skills, which is engineering and technical, is not at all correlated with the routine task intensity index, okay? And moreover, if we do the same with years of schooling, we found exactly the same. A remark here, engineering and technical skills are not only skills that you acquire in engineering school, are also a lot of skills that you acquire in vocational and upper secondary schools. So it's not, that's why it's not correlated with the years of schooling. Okay? So then we put this green skill measure at work, and we found a very, very strong and robust across various application evidence that these skills are the most important one for the green transition. So here I'm talking about results of causal rigorous policy evaluation. So for instance, if we use the standard quasi experiment of the Cleaner Act, we found that the non-attainment US region, so the region with more stringent environmental policies, they are also the one where there is an increase in the demand of green skills, especially technical and engineering skills. Using energy price shock with a shift share IV, we found that the long-term increase in the demand of energy prices increased the demand of technical skills in Europe and in France. Moreover, we found that the effectiveness of the US green fiscal push of Obama is crucially mediated on the variability, on the local variability of green skills. So the regions that have more green skills are the ones that have much larger job multiplier effect, okay? So actually that's super important. And actually we found also that the technical skill biasness of green job is confirmed in job vacancy data. So we redid all the analysis with job vacancy data and we found the same. However, in this case, we observed that the skill gap are more spread and they pertain also IT and social skills. And this is not surprising because, as you know, the decarbonization of the economy require also the so-called twin transition, so require also the use of digital technologies like meters and stuff like that. Okay, so it is not surprising that IT skills are more important for the subset of low carbon jobs. Okay, and finally, we found also that green jobs require more on the job training, which is very often technical, is used to teach technical skills, and STEM graduates. Okay, so how much time do we have? So let me skip here. Here is, job vacancy data. Let me go direct here. Here I'm using job vacancy data to show you a result that is also found in normal or net data. Here we measure for the 2 occupations. The nice stuff of job vacancy data is that you can measure what happened within narrowly defined occupation. Okay, we have enough density of job ads to see what's happening, for instance, within engineers and within construction and extraction workers. Okay, so these are the 2 occupations that are more interesting for the green transition because they contain both green jobs, so low carbon jobs, high carbon jobs and neither high carbon and nor low carbon jobs. So what we found here is that there is a skill gap in favor of low carbon jobs for technical, social, managerial, IT, and cognitive skills, but high carbon jobs are more similar to low carbon jobs than to other jobs. This is the bottom line of this figure, and the same is for construction and also when you use ONET data. Okay, and this you can also see computing confidence interval, and so computing statistical significance, exploiting the variation of the skill gap across commuting zone in the US, and I highlighted in green the gap that are statistically significant and larger than 3.5%, and you see that the biggest gap are for technical, but they're only the biggest gap when we compare low carbon and generic ads, but when we compare low carbon and high carbon ads, the gaps are much smaller, okay? So then let me talk about wages. This is a very important point because, I mean, then we have that green jobs, low carbon jobs are more complex in terms of skills, so we should expect that they pay higher wages, okay? Actually, unfortunately, this is not the case. Actually, it was the case just after the Obama green stimulus push. I'm not claiming causality here, I'm just speaking about some correlation. After the Obama green stimulus push, the premium for green jobs within occupations and controlling for education and et cetera, experience all the information that you have in job vacancy data was larger, was positive and statistically significant, but it declined dramatically in the second period of our analysis, so 2017, 2019. So in the second period, the green jobs wage premium, it almost disappeared for all occupation except installation and maintenance and engineering technicians. Okay, if we compare this green wage premium with a brown wage premium, again controlling for a lot of intervening factors, here we see that the brown wage premium is very, very large. In the first period is above 20%, controlling for several characteristics. It declines, but it remains much larger than the green wage premium. Okay. So you may wonder, this is just the demand side, what happened with the real US data? So we use American Community Survey data to see if this is the same picture emerged with American Community Survey data, and yes, it's the same picture. So actually, you see this for high-skilled worker, the fossil fuel worker pay 46.2 hourly wage compared to 38.5 low-carbon high-skilled worker. And these are the matched occupations, similar occupation at 2-digit SOC level or a 3-digit SOC level, that they pay slightly less than low carbon jobs, but very similar to low carbon jobs. Another interesting feature is that both low carbon and fossil fuel workers are much, much more intensive of STEM degrees. Okay, so they require much more STEM degrees than similar occupation. Okay, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math degrees. And also green jobs, I already told you this, but I want to remind you this, require much more on the job training than both brown jobs and matched 2-digit or 3-digit jobs. Okay, the same picture is for low-skilled jobs. So I skipped this slide. Okay, so then I want to finish the part on wages by showing this graph that is for me is a bit worrisome. Why is a bit worrisome? Here we measure the returns for a STEM graduate in several positions: finance, STEM jobs, so like Google, green jobs, and other jobs. Okay, you see that there is a huge gap between what a STEM graduates can get if he goes to work to Goldman Sachs in red without bonus. So this can be 3 times more, and if he goes to work for Google or Amazon, compare how much he gets if he goes to work in a green job. This is very worrisome because this means that the talents that we need to do more innovation in the green economy, still we need a lot of innovation in the green economy, where they're not going to work in green jobs, but they're going to work in these positions. So let me finish with a new measure. I promise you that I will speak also about brown jobs. So give me 2 minutes more because I present you a new measure that can be useful also for other countries of the carbon content of jobs. So actually, a similar problem of measuring green jobs we have also for brown jobs. Why we have a similar problem? We know that coal miners will be affected by the green transition, but we also know that there has been a huge already there has been a lot of decrease in the carbon intensity of several productions. So these cannot be captured by standard occupational classification that are intrinsically static. Okay, so how we can capture this? We can capture this using a measure of the carbon content of job. We do it for France for almost 2 decades. Because we have good data, but this can be done also in other countries, where we have this is the CO2 emission of at the plant level for at time t over the total employment at the plant at time t, and we reweight all these. We have data on the universe of the employees. In France has the best data probably in the world on the universe of employees in plants I in occupation O over the total number of employees in occupation O. Okay, so we can compute this carbon content of occupation that is time varying, so it captures also to what extent an occupation decarbonized. If you don't have plant level data, you can do the same stuff using sector level data. Okay, so it will work perfectly fine. Okay, I will be very quick here, and I want to show some feature of the high carbon jobs. So the high carbon jobs have particular features that they are more exposed to all the other shocks that you can imagine. They are more exposed to the China shock. Okay, that is a positive correlation, because I can compute the same stuff replacing CO2 CO2 with import, for instance, or I can replace CO2 with capital, whatever. Okay, and so I did this, and we computed that this is positively correlated between the carbon content of the occupation and the import from China. Okay, there is a positive correlation between the capital intensive and the carbon content. This is the first period and this is the last period, just to see if there has been an evolution of some type. There is a positive correlation between the carbon content of jobs and the concentration of the job in a particular region. So actually, this is important to understand to what extent there will be negative job multiplier effect, and there will be. So actually, this is a caveat, very important. Since we found that they are so much correlated with other shock that negatively affect the labor market condition of worker, you have to be very careful to disentangle which is the real contribution of, for instance, a carbon tax with respect to the China shock, with respect to automation and other structural factors, because that's extremely correlated. So you may end up capturing an effect that you attribute to the carbon pricing or to energy pricing, but this is actually an effect that is related to other factors. Then let me skip this and let me go to my final slide. This is really the final slide. Here we estimate the correlation between the change in the log of Y can be wages of or employment of occupation O at time t on the initial carbon intensity of job, the initial greenness of job. We did what I suggest you not to do. So we impute the greenness of net to France, but since we have 411 occupation in France, this is quite accurate because we move from 1,000 occupation to 411 is quite accurate, the way of measuring the greenness for France. Okay, so actually, and we regress this controlling for the China shock, the share of manufacturing employment, capital intensity, and locational Gini coefficient. This is just correlation, is of course not causal. But we found what we call what we are calling now, this is in progress work, what we are calling now the green wage premium puzzle. We are pushing toward this direction. So actually you see that the growth rate of wages is significantly higher in occupation that have a higher carbon intensity. The opposite is for the greenness. So the occupation that have higher greenness, they have a lower growth rate, wage growth. And for employment, is the other way around. So there is a negative employment growth for occupation that have a higher carbon content, and a positive employment growth for occupation that have a higher greenness. Okay, and when we quantify this effect, we quantify this effect of an interquantile change in the low carbon content compared to the historical change in wages of the occupation. We found that this effect are around 10% of the historical changes, positive and negative for 11% for carbon content, and around 9 to 6% for green. Okay. So actually, let me conclude. The green transition is like a double-edged sword. We need two metrics to understand it. One is not enough. Engineering and technical skills, not necessarily associated with high qualification, are the key feature of green and low carbon occupation. Reskilling and targeted on the job training are essential to enhance the effectiveness and the equity of green recovery package. I didn't show you this a lot, but this is our key result for the evaluation of the Obama green stimulus package. Here I want to give you a kind of pessimistic view, because there is a database of the OECD about green recovery package. Unfortunately, only 2% of the measure in this database, list measure for the green economy are for retraining workers. Okay. Then we found that there is this green wage premium puzzle, and this is something where more research is needed using longitudinal level data, and we are moving in this direction. I want to thank all my co-authors. All these papers are several papers with lots of co-authors, starting from my main one, Giovanni Marin, Pop, Davide Consoli, Misato Sato, Aurelian Sosse, Xiao Chen, and Laila O'Kane. So these are all the groups of workers. Thanks a lot.
Quick clarifications now, and then at the end, the idea was to have a more general discussion for a few more minutes. But if there are immediate clarifications right now for Francesco. No, good. Okay. And with that, to our next speaker, Stefano.
I'll wait for the slides for a moment. I don't know why this is zooming towards me. Okay, here we are. So thanks a lot, everyone, for still being here for the last session of today. And thanks for the organizer and Christian for making these special sessions where I can present our work with my amazing co-author, Sacha on the green transition and skill reallocation. So what we do, is this on? Yeah. So what we do in this work, we take Francesco's work as a starting point and then trying to find out what are the more general outcomes of it for the decarbonization of the economy as a whole. So we're thinking that moving towards a green transition is essentially a large technological transformation where, as Francesco already mentioned, you have on the one hand the brown sector contracting and the green one expanding, but you also have sectors that need to go through a transformation in order to meet green demand. So the first question is, do firms actually adopt the technologies when they become available? And if you look at the US and the energy intensive sector, you can see that the average age of technologies in use is around 7-8 years. This means that even if fully carbon neutral technologies were to be made available today, it would still take another 7-8 years for the economy as a whole to decarbonize. And that's a long period, given that we have about 20, 25, maximum 30 years to decarbonize. So what we do is that we want to study this pace of green technology adoption, and more specifically, to see how it interacts with labor markets. Now, this is a graph from a recent questionnaire of Dutch firms where employers were asked, do your employees need to have the following skills to work with energy efficient technologies? And now you can only look at the top answer, which is no other skills than before. Only half of them say that their employees do not need new skills to work with energy efficient technologies. Okay, so seeing it the other way around, half of the employers say that if they were to adopt green technologies, their workers would need different sets of skills. So now the question is, are these skills out there or is there a shortage? And Francesco talked lots about it. I'm not going to go through it, but his work shows that actually the skills, to some extent, there are out there. People that work in brown job do have similar skills to some extent to what the green jobs required, which is why in our work we focus on skill sorting, namely the reallocation of workers with green skills from brown to green occupations and not for aggregate skill sorting per se. So what we do is that we study the green technology updating, and it's the two-way interaction that it gives rise to between labor markets and decarbonization. On the one hand, the presence of labor market frictions makes it harder for firms to find the right workers when they update, which increases the cost of new technology adoption and slows down decarbonization. On the other hand, if we push through a quick decarbonization, which I also hope we do, this is going to affect labor markets, as it might give rise to higher labor market transitions as firms try to find the right workers for their new green technologies. So we study this interaction and we find a couple of things. The first thing is that frictions result into workers with green skills being locked in brown jobs. And this happens because this brown occupation extend the use of their technology by around 35%, is what we find. And half of it is directly attributed into imperfect skill sort. Now, the effect of this can become even stronger if the new green technologies that arrive are even more specialized. And then we look at a carbon tax as a potential policy to affect this, and we find that, of course, a carbon tax does lead to a higher pace of decarbonization, but does not act on the skills themselves, of course, because a carbon tax only acts on the production. So this is the only equation that I have in my slides, I promise. What we do is that we set up a model of a labor market with frictions, which means it takes time for firms to find people to interview and find people to hire. And this labor market has skill heterogeneity both on the worker side, so workers have different types of skills, and also the technologies in use require different skills to operate. Now, if a firm hires a worker, a match is formed between a worker and a certain technology, we use this equation as a proxy of the productivity of this match, which has two parts. Does this work? So the part on the left-hand side depends on the age of the technology. And you see that as the technology age increases, this reduces exponentially. This is relatively to the most new technology available. So this is essentially to say that we assume that technologies become exponentially more green with time, where the pace of this creation of new technologies is given by eta. So you can think about this either as new technologies become more energy efficient with time, or you can also think about it as the demand for green products increasing with time. So this is the first part. The second part has to do with something that Francesco also noted a few times. It has to do with the skills gap between the worker and the firm. If the skills of a worker are not the same as the skills required by the technology to operate, then the matching will be less productive. And this is given by this X squared term, where X is the skills gap. Gamma here gives the importance of this skills gap in production, which we interpret as the specialization of the job. So now let's see how this model looks time-wise. It has three stages. Firms enter the market when they buy a new technology. The technology then starts aging as the markets produce, and then at some point they scrap the technology and they can update to a new one. So in the first stage, firms pay an investment cost I to purchase the newest available technology. And then they look for a worker. If they don't find a worker in the first period, because they didn't find someone to interview, of course, there's no production. If they do find someone to interview, then the skill match between their technology and the worker is realized. If the skill match is small, they decide to match and they start working together. If the skill match is large, then they don't, and the firm moves on to the next period. Now, in the next period, the technology ages. Now, a firm that didn't manage to get a worker in the previous period goes through the same process. They look for someone to interview, and they look whether the skill match, mismatch is small or large. At a firm that already hired a worker in the previous period has three possible outcomes. The first one is that matches are exogenously dislodged for whatever reason. These are just random shocks to jobs. And then two possible things can happen. As the technology ages, if the skill mismatch is large, then it might be that relatively to a new technology, the match is not productive enough and the worker decides to leave and look for a better paying job. If though the technology is not old enough, then they just keep on producing. Now, at some point, the technology becomes so old that it cannot be productive with any worker enough to pay their wages, which means that the firm just scraps the technology. This is at age A star, which I will call from now on the scrapping age, exits the market and breaks the matching, and then they can re-enter by buying the new technology. So what we do is that we solve this model and we calibrate using US data. And now I want to show you what is the outcome of this. So this first graph gives the age distribution of worker-firm matches. Now the blue line is the case where there's no labor market frictions. In that case, firms buy a technology and straight away they find the perfect worker. And what happens is they keep the worker until at some point at the scrapping age of the competitive equilibrium A star CE, at that point, the newest available technology is so much more productive that it worths for them to just scrap their old technology and update to the newer. Now, the black lines represent cases where there is labor market frictions. The first thing that you see, as there's labor market frictions, it takes some time in the beginning for firms to find their workers. They don't find them straight away. Then they start producing, and then they reach the age at which, in the competitive case, they would have updated. Now, though, they take into account that if they update to the newest available technology, they might also have to look for a new worker. This adds an extra cost to updating, which makes it less desirable. Hence, firms will keep the technology for longer and go on working. In our calibration, this increases the age in use of technology from around 12 years to around 16. So that's an increase of about 35% due to frictions. This is the first part of our two-way interaction, right? The presence of labor market frictions slows down the decarbonization as firms with all technologies keep them for a longer period of time. Now, importantly, as Francesco discussed plenty, workers that are here in brown jobs do have the skills that would be needed to operate also newer green technologies. As a result, if a new firm wants to enter and be a green firm, it will not do because the worker is still hired by the old brown firm. Hence, it will be more costly for them to look for a new worker. This is what I mean when I say that workers with green skills are locked into brown jobs. These old firms lock in the workers. Hence, new green firms cannot enter because they will not have the right workers to operate. Now, what I do is that I focus only on the scrapping age, so you can forget the rest of the distribution. We have already seen that the first part is due to sunk cost, namely that firms keep on their technology for a while and they don't update straight away because they need to pay upfront costs. And then the second part is due to frictions, but we want to disentangle this part. So here you can focus first just on the left panel. You can see that we plot the scrapping age that we discussed before. On the x-axis, we have eta, which is the pace of the creation of new technologies, okay? How quickly greener technologies become available in the market. Now, the first thing that you see is that the scrapping age goes down with increased pace of technology. This makes sense, right? If the available technologies become greener faster, firms will also update quicker. Now, we also saw that the first part, the larger part of the scrapping age, is due to the fact that investment costs are sunk. They need to be paid upfront when you buy the technology. The second part, that increases by 35%, we actually can split it in two parts. The first one is due to the search friction themselves, namely the cost of having to look for a worker to interview. The second part is the mismatch effect, which is due to the fact that even if you find someone to interview, they might not have the right skills to operate the technology. On the right panel, you look at exactly the same case, but now with a higher specialization. A higher specialization of the green technology would mean that it's even harder to find someone with the correct skills, which means that the mismatch effect would become stronger in that case. Now, I want to move to the other side of the two-way interaction and look at labor market transitions. So on the y-axis, we have labor market transition, namely how many people move in and out of employment. And we see this again on the x-axis, we have the pace of technological creation. And we look at this for different specializations. Now, the first thing you see is that higher specialization leads to higher labor market transitions, namely because mismatch there is more important, workers become redundant more often, and firms need to look for new workers. The more interesting part, though, is what happens along the x-axis. We currently stand, or at least in the US, around here. In order to reach our goals of a carbon neutral economy by roughly 2040, 2050, predictions are that we need this to rise to roughly 0.04. As a result, you see that if we were to push with the green transition in the pace that we have to in order to decarbonize our economies, labor market transitions would increase by about 10%. This happens because firms will have to update more quickly into new green technologies, which means that they will more often have to look for new workers, which is going to lead to more fires and hirings as these firms look for people with the right skills. This is the second part of our two-way effect. A higher pace of decarbonization leads to more labor market transitions, which is important for the acceptance for the essentially political economy side of the green transition, as Francesco has also talked to one of his small but very nice papers. Now, what we can do about it, now the first question always with decarbonization policies is a carbon tax. This is easily modeled. Oh, sorry, I promised I would only have one equation. This is the same one, just with an extra term. This extra term says that if a technology is old, you tax it. So this is essentially what the carbon tax is. And we look again at the scrapping age along different pace of decarbonization. And you see the blue line is without a carbon tax. The thick line is if we didn't have frictions, and then the other one is if we had frictions, what we've already seen. What you see is that when a carbon tax is added, so the black lines, indeed, the scrapping age reduces, so decarbonization goes quicker, but you don't really see an effect in the gap between those two lines. Okay, so the carbon tax does not act directly into the part that has to do with frictions, which makes perfect sense because the carbon tax has nothing to say about skills. So what have we said so far? So skill sorting extends the life of older technologies because it makes it more costly to update. As a result, workers with green skills are locked in brown jobs. This effect is stronger if the green technologies are highly specialized. And also, as a result, if we push for a quick decarbonization, we're going to have effects in the labor market. So what can we do beyond a carbon tax? Namely, what can we do about retraining? Now, I'm going to look at a few ingredients that I haven't formally added in the model, but this is work for the future. And how would this affect this picture that we see? Now, for once, when firms update their technology, they will not always have to look for a new worker. Sometimes the worker that they have can stay. This would reduce the light blue, given that they do not have to always look to interview a new worker. Nicely enough, they can also retrain the worker. If you can retrain the worker, then the mismatch becomes less important because you can reduce it, which means that the mismatch effect, the other blue line, would also become smaller. Now, on the other hand, we had said that skill sorting is the important factor that we're looking at here because people in brown jobs do have the right skills. But this doesn't mean that there is not at all any skill shortage, right? It's found also in the US by a paper of Pop et al. And also at an upcoming OECD paper that we are having, that different countries and different areas do have a different supply of green skills, which means that some areas will have aggregate skill shortages. If the skill shortages are there, then the dark blue line will be higher because there would be higher mismatch in the economy. And lastly, the effect of subsidies would be to reduce this gray part, the one that has to do with the sunk costs. Now, I was told that I would have to think also and this is my last slide, so no worries, of how shall we think about developing countries within this context. Now, nicely enough, this context does not talk about the development level, right? It's a general framework that can be applied in principle in many different areas. Of course, though, it can result to different quantitative effects. The first one is if the investment to productivity ratio is different. So if productivity is lower in a developing country, the relative cost of investing for new technologies is higher, which means that this gray part is going to be higher. Okay, we're going to have a slower adoption of technologies simply because they're relatively less expensive. It's okay, just for a moment I thought it was mine and that would have been funny. The second part is that labor markets can be more inefficient. Okay, if there's not much online vacancies and so on, this can mean that there is higher frictions in the labor market, meaning that the blue part of our scrapping age can be higher. So both those two factors can lead to a slower decarbonization pace, not mine again. But these are two things that we can relatively easily calibrate using exactly the same things that we used in the US scenario. That is the unemployment level, unemployment duration, vacancy duration, and so on. So these things could lead to different quantitative results, but it's something we can relatively easily calibrate. The last one part is a bit more tricky and has to do with the green skill supply. Namely, how important is the part that has to do with aggregate skill shortage, which we showed in the previous slide that would increase the dark blue part. How important is this for countries at different development level? If the aggregate skill, green skill supply is lower, this will also slow down the decarbonization. So what can we do about it? So in a upcoming OECD paper with a colleague, we do look at different countries, but only at OECD countries. So essentially, the US, Europe, and Australia. And there, it's, as Francesco has already said, it's relatively okay to assume that occupations have relatively the same skill content. So we can just use the owner data to calculate how the green skill supply varies across these countries. Making the same assumption about the task content of occupation across countries of different development level is probably not a very good idea. So the question is, how would one do this? Now, we also had, I can find her, Hannah, I think earlier had a presentation of looking at the skill context in Uruguay, which I found very interesting. Another work that is ongoing, and I expect it to come out as a working paper in a bit by Marcel Timmer in the Netherlands, where they also look at countries along different development levels, but for different reasons. And what they use as a skills proxy is not occupation, but occupation per sector. And they claim that this can be a better proxy because occupations can have different skill intensity across different development levels, but probably not as much if you look at occupation per sector. Okay, this means that we could create skill measures of occupation per sector using a baseline in the US or wherever else, and then use this to estimate the green skill supply of countries of different development levels. Okay, in this way, we could use this framework also for developing countries and see, one, how fast can the decarbonization occur, and secondly, also, what will be the effect of decarbonization on the labor market, specifically on the affected workers in brown occupations. That's it. And thanks a lot, and open to any questions.
Yeah, same as before. Question of clarifications now. Otherwise, moving to our third and last speaker, Margaret. Anyone? No? Good. Thank you so much. Okay. Margaret, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Nicker is here. Slides should be there.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Christian, for this great opportunity and to meet this wonderful group. Thank you, of course, Aaron, as well for this conference. So I'm Margaret Chitiga-Mabugu. I'm working at the University of Pretoria here in South Africa, further north from here in beautiful Cape Town. Firstly, before I start, let me have two disclaimers. So I have a deep fear standing here in front of you. The fear is simply that I will probably not be able to go through everything I want to go through today. So what did I think about? I thought I will skip over some slides. So if I go too fast, it's simply to overcome this fear that I have. We can always come back to this if you find it interesting. The second disclaimer is simply that while I was part of the team that developed the tool that I want to talk about now, I was not always part of the teams that did the practical work in the different countries. So I'm presenting this essentially on behalf of the ILO. The ILO is really responsible, and as well as some UN organizations, as a page member, Partnership for Action for Green Jobs, as well as a Climate Action for Jobs member. If I say anything that's controversial, it has nothing to do with the ILO or the modelers. Two disclaimers done, let's go. Okay, so in terms of outline, I will really just talk about this network, the GAIN network, which is responsible for the tool that I would like to say a little bit about, but more enthusiastic to show how it is applied in the different countries and what types of information and data that you get out of that. So then I talk about the Green Jobs Training Guidebook. This is the ILO book that I wanted to talk about. Then I will talk as well about the Green Jobs GJAMs, as we call them, modeling. So the conceptualization of this model, everyone here was trained as an economist who understand immediately when I start talking about this, because I taught about this in the first year of economics. Believe it or not, it's still relevant today. At least we think so. The green economy modeling in different countries, as I said, is what I want to focus on in different applications. I will emphasize perhaps two specific countries just to show some of the data that one gets, and perhaps to also go to some of the questions about skills in a different context. I will end with just very quickly talking about data issues in these types of modeling and these types of countries that we live in. So GAIN is an international network of individual researchers, research institutions, international organizations, particularly the ILO and UN agencies. And the idea really is to try and develop tools that would assist policymakers in making more informed decisions on just transitions, particularly in terms of climate change. So this particular tool we talk about is really grounded in national accounting systems. As I say, this is what we learn in the very first years of economics in university. And it's allowing us to say something about quantities in terms of greening. So if you invest in green sectors or green activities, what is likely to be the impact on policy? This is framed within the just transition, because essentially what had happened is that when we had intended nationally determined contributions, some of you might know this or seen this, particularly in our developing countries, they were relatively dry in the sense that they would talk about emission ambitions. They talked about the timeframes for emissions. They talked about the sectors from which governments were projecting these emissions to come out of. And finally, they talked a little bit about the investments that were required. So to some extent, there was nothing really in terms of the socio-economy. How does the economy react? What do we say about jobs? What is it about the just transition that we can say about these NDCs? As a result, we tended to see that in many countries, there was a task team that was set up to deal with the Paris Agreement and climate change, and the rest of the economy continued with business as usual. So obviously this doesn't work. Questions started to be asked by ILO and many of you yourselves talking about, well, but what is the issue in terms of just transition, and particularly in terms of jobs gained or lost during this transition. So this is the tool, this is the book rather, the guidebook, which is owned by the ILO, as I mentioned. And the tool is aiming at laying down the main foundation in terms of knowledge and practice in order to allow country ownership of green jobs assessment models. So it's very much related to policy and works hand in hand with policymakers, as I said, particularly in terms of drafting the NDCs. So moving from the INDCs to the new NDCs, the revised ones for 2021, you will see for the countries at least that I mentioned here that there is already recognition of the importance of some of the work that is coming out of the modeling. This model, of course, can be used by anybody. It's freely available to anyone. So I will not belabor the point of what are green jobs. I think Francesco did a great job there. But what we simply look for is in the different sectors or different activities or different industries, can we distinguish between activities that reduce consumption of energy and raw materials, that limit greenhouse gas emissions, that minimize waste and pollution, that protect and restore ecosystems, or contribute to adapting to climate change. So are these processes or are these goods and services? And then we make that distinction in measuring the green job. So the book goes in detail in terms of how we do this, using, of course, the ILO definitions and as well as UNEP. So just in terms of the modeling, the conceptualization, and I do not have any equations. It was simply, the idea is really to understand the inter-industry transactions that take place. Okay, so when you have an industry, it produces goods and services that are sold either to other industries or to final demand. The usual circular flow of income is what we use. And this is, of course, captured in the supply and use tables that the majority of our countries here, developed and developing, do produce. So using that kind of analysis and setting up a nice data set that shows the shape and form of and structure of an economy, we then use that data set to try and understand a little bit what happens when you invest in a sector. How many jobs directly are produced, how many jobs indirectly are produced. So again, to look at the forward linkages over time, how does the economy or the structure of the economy change as you green your economy more and more, and therefore what happens to jobs? What happens to those brown jobs, and what happens then to the overall economy in terms of net job creation? That's essentially what we do. So this data set and the way it's organized allows us to capture the circulation of products within the economy within a given period. It allows us to handle all these complexities that we would otherwise, at least certainly policymakers would not have been able to handle in terms of the effects of activities, the counter effects, the actions, the reactions that would take place within an economy when there is an investment. So we're moving away. So while we're using the micro approach, we're also understanding that this has a macro implication on the economy. So it's a combination of these two. So this tool would allow us in the end to distinguish between direct and indirect relations and interactions between economic agents. Essentially, we ask the following questions. So if you invested in green technology, if you promise in your NDCs to reduce emissions by so much by 2030, for example, and you say to your colleagues in other countries, I'm going to invest in these different economies, what happens to jobs? Of course, what happens to output? Of course, we want to know this as well, but you generally say what happens to emissions. So the tool allows us to be able to understand investing in sustainable practices, what is the impact on our economies, and particularly these three variables: output, emissions, and jobs. Or you could ask for a given level of investment. So for instance, you do not have money, which we don't have in developing countries. We tend to think, well, with the limited amount of money that I have, in which sectors must I invest? I think these were questions also that had been mentioned earlier. So where would I get the best back for a bang for my buck, so to speak? Where is the greatest number of jobs going to come from if I have to choose certain sectors? So this is, as I say, traditionally you would have used the input-output modeling. Of course, we sophisticated much more now because we have learned a lot more since Leon Jeff and his Nobel Prize. We make these models more dynamic, we adjust to prices. So these limiting assumptions we're able to get out of them. And as I said, we connect this to the macro modeling. Okay. So I want to skip over a few things. Important is that we need supply and use tables and supply and use data from different countries. I will say at the end something about the limitations in different countries on this, the quality and the quantity and the frequency of supply and use data. And I want to just also mention that I want to talk to you about some of the countries here. I want to spend a bit of time talking about a country like Zimbabwe, which many of us think is really redundant, but you will see the type of work that had been done there is quite interesting. I want to say a little bit of work on Mauritius, particularly to talk about skills. I want to say a bit about South Africa because I was part of this modeling as well, but then I will not really have enough time to talk about this. But these are reports, ILO reports that are available in case you are interested in them. So the methodology itself, as I said, is really using that inter-industry interactions here and here. And then also, of course, taking into account that when you produce, you also sell to final use. As I say, I'm preaching to people who already know, many of you are trained in this way, but we then also sophisticate it in some senses by making it more dynamic. So we want to understand the impact over time and not only the static impacts. So by taking into account population growth, GDP growth, as well as interactions in terms of elasticities for consumption, we're able to say a little bit more about what happens, the complexities that happen within an economy. What I want to say here. So this is not forecasting. We're not forecasting, we are projecting. We're saying if you invested in this sector with so much funding, this is what would happen compared to the baseline, okay? So we will say something about the direction and possible size of effects, but not necessarily be worried about the exact amounts of jobs that are created. We get an indication, which indication is absolutely required by policymakers when they make promises about NDCs and as they prepare the economies to meet the nationally determined contributions. Okay, I will go over this. We'll talk about scenarios. Therefore, this is not forecasting. We're simply comparing a new way or an imagined future, which is what we do in NDCs, compared to business as usual, so to speak. Okay. So let's go to some applications. We'll start with this application in Zimbabwe. The application is interesting, and what's important upfront is that the typical tool should really be used per country because the country's structure matters a great deal, as you will see when I present the results of this country. The size of the economy matters, the size of the investment matters, and as well the business as usual, the current state of the economy matters. So this tool is really very good because it's the same tool that you can use for many different countries, but taking into account the complexities of the different countries. So in the case of this country, the NDC sectors that are promised, except for waste, are taken into account into the modeling, energy sectors, the IPPU sectors, as well as the agriculture and forestry sectors, okay? In the end, 11 sectors are modeled, or we ask questions about how investment in each of these sectors or processes would impact jobs in this country. So for instance, I can already tell you that the biggest investment promised in the NDC for Zimbabwe is building a dam and generating energy out of this, but also a few others, biogas, commercial solar, off-grid solar, etc. And then some smart agriculture in addition to reducing deforestation by coming up with efficient cook stores. So the main finding, not surprisingly, is that the biggest investment promise produces as well the biggest jobs. This is not in terms of direct jobs. This is not surprising. And the reason is really that the commitment for investment is $5.4 billion to build this dam. Compared to, for example, investment promised for biomass, which is 100 million. So the modeling is a 10-year modeling to try and understand over the 10 years what would happen in our economy in this country. So therefore, the dam building itself, in terms of direct jobs, because of construction, produces the most in terms of GDP, the most in terms of jobs, and of course, the most in terms of emissions during the building process. So the question then becomes, well, this is all good, but if we were to compare not rand for rand, but dollar for dollar in this particular economy, what would happen in the different sectors? So very interestingly, you will see that, in fact, comparing rand for rand and the returns to this investment in the dam building, hydro building, after the dam is built and electricity is being produced, while it is greener, it does not produce any more jobs than the normal electricity. Okay, so the impact actually halves simply because, of course, you have more electricity in the economy. So the modeling itself is not replacing brown sectors. It's simply building up to on top of what we have in the brown sectors. We think this is more realistic in African countries, not to phase out, but rather to phase down brown sectors. So on the contrary, you will see that in other sectors, the biogas sector, where the investment was much smaller, the multiplier is much higher. So for instance, you see that in the biogas plant building, in terms of multipliers, if you were to invest $1 million in this sector, you create about 130 economy-wide jobs compared to 100 if it was in the dam building, which has the highest investment, and much smaller if you're talking about commercial solar. This is more the technology here is many of us know tends to be more capital intensive. The dam I already explained is really because after you've built the dam, there's not much extra activities going on. But this particular biogas plant continues over time in terms of producing jobs. So what this okay, before I go to that implication, I just wanted to show you some numbers here. So what this tool can do, it allows us to understand the total numbers of jobs created over a 10-year period, given the investment. And we saw very clearly that the hydro produces the majority of jobs, while the biomass doesn't produce that much. Whereas it also allows us to judge, pay 100,000 or 1 million or $1 how many jobs are created. In this case, you can see, as I said, biogas is much more than the hydro. But these are anyway, all the other sectors, I don't have time to really talk about those. What also you can do with this type of tool, and if you have good data, and that's very important, so you can disaggregate this by gender as well and by skill. So you would be able to know in 2030, what is the likely impact of this investment in order for us to meet the commitment that we made in the nationally determined contributions. But we saw that one result that is important is that the size of investment matters. So the question then is also, what about the type of investment? And we see clearly that the sector in which you invest matters. This is information that policymakers would not necessarily have had on their fingertips in terms of selecting which sectors they would prioritize. So while you have a lot of funding that you commit for dam building, it might be that if you have limited resources or if you use your own resources, because remember for NDCs, you have committed investment versus conditional, or conditional versus unconditional. So for the unconditional, you're using your own funding as a country, and for conditional, you are looking to get funding from elsewhere. So you might, in this case, leave out the big investments for external funding while you look at smaller investment that do create more multipliers or higher multipliers than the big investments, if that makes sense. I will not say too much here, just simply to say that after the intended NDC for this country, you will see now the revised NDC for 2021 is totally different. It's no longer as dry as the first ones. It's now talking about the potential for job creation. It's certainly more ambitious. It also recognizes that there are core benefits that come out of emission reductions. Once again, giving policymakers much more better voice when they negotiate in terms of the NDCs and when they make commitments for nationally determined contributions. Few other examples, and I think I'm probably going to run out of time very soon, but just for Mauritius, 5 more minutes, good. Mauritius did the same, so I will not repeat that. But what I want to show is that what you can do with this tool is go a little bit further and ask questions about skills. So while we say that countries would gain so many jobs in the future, the question is, are countries prepared for this? And therefore, using this tool, you can be able to already project what types of skills. And we're using the I-score in this particular case. So not necessarily the most perfect, but per sector, we're asking for different skills. What are you likely to need? How can you prepare? So once again, countries or policymakers start to work together, okay? So it's not only the climate ministry or department, but also the education department is important, right? For preparing, for training for the future. So in the agricultural sector, how many managers do you need? How many of these sectors? We used only the 9 sectors there in ISCO. And then you'll see the same is true for different sectors. If you're talking manufacturing and industry and textile, the number of managers that you require for the future is different. Of course, the type of management is also very different. You do the same for accommodation, lodging sector, and again, prepare for the future in terms of the skills that are required, so that by the time this comes, if you do indeed a transition, the transition is just. People are ready for the jobs, for the green jobs. The same is true for renewables. And so this is an additional modeling that you can do once you know how sectors would react to a given investment. In South Africa, we did a modeling that was very much related to what Trudy was talking about earlier, or what we call the Ramaphosa plan, or the economic reconstruction and recovery plan. And we model to understand the conventional policies impacts on jobs, the public works impacts, cumulatively that is, and then green elements. But then we also asked, well, couldn't we be more ambitious in South Africa and see what happens with the green push? And without wasting too much time, we see very clearly that conventional policies, while they help you to grow your economy as we would expect, because in any case, the investment in conventional policies is much higher, as I've shown now earlier for the case of Zimbabwe. But if you were to be daring and green, be more ambitious in terms of greening your economy, we see that this not only allows you to do better in terms of output production, but also in terms of employment. And indeed, this greening is the only way that would then, of course, allow you to reduce CO2 emissions. If you continued with business as usual, you would soon come back to the pre-COVID emissions. So clearly showing the benefits of being ambitious in terms of green modeling. Yes, so I will not talk about the rest of these other countries, as I had this information will be there in case you're interested. The reports are also available in ILO. Finally, I want to end with a song. Are you ready? Don't worry, Tishnasha, I'm not actually going to sing. The song is really about data. Yeah? So data is a problem. We need to to bring this up every time we're in a room where there is potentially a policymaker here or somebody who is interested in data collection. Collecting this type of data or using these types of tools needs a lot of data, micro data. So for South Africa and a few other countries, we have very good supply and use tables, very fortunately. They are not collected as frequently as we would like, but for many countries, even though they might have supply and use tables, they do not have enough information. So we don't know much about gender. We don't know about the agricultural sectors. We don't know enough about the informal sectors. We do not know enough about the ages of the people who are working in order for us to be more precise in what we inform a policy, and particularly in preparation for the transition that we said, and someone mentioned earlier, this is inevitable. It has to happen. So just again, the song is, the more data we have, the better. The better quality data we have, the better we can inform and assist with policy making. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And then as a final round, we can do one quick round of clarifications, if any, or otherwise more general reflections about any of the speakers. Again, completely acknowledge the fact that there are penguins later. So, Francesco.
I have a general appreciation for the last talk, and I mean it's a bit also for my talk and the talk of time. I mean, we always have to consider that we have also to look at the real effect on the environment. I mean, for instance, when you consider biogas as green, this is very, very, very questionable. I mean, biogas is going to lead to a lot of deforestation on the one hand, and on the other hand, anyway, if biogas is not generated by biomass that is from recycled, you know, this is going to be a bit tricky. And the second point is related to because we focus a lot, myself also, so it's also, I mean, a comment about myself. We focus a lot about the issue of decarbonization, but I think especially for developing countries, there is a general issue of co-benefit and co-damages, because you are going to create perhaps another environmental problem by resolving the first one. I mean, I think also mining lithium, mining cobalt is going to create other social and environment, perhaps, I mean, social environment.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that is true. So if you look at the NDCs, I think the ambitions for most of the developing countries is to go gradual. Okay, so where you can start to go green, not fully 100% green, if you can go 50% green, that's already a way towards green. I think that is the attitude that they are taking. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah. So I think we have to be super careful. Yeah. So this is a warning to policymakers, right? So what we're modeling is what they have in their NDCs. Yeah.
Back there in the last row, and Stefanos.
Yeah, thank you very much for 3 excellent presentations. One common theme was labor market transition cost. And to be honest with you, I hadn't really thought that much about that as an extra cost for greening. So my question is, do you have a sense or approximation of how large those labor market adjustment costs are, the transition costs? And is it much higher in developing countries? Because I think of like the Artuch and McLaren study in the AER, where they estimated that transition costs for workers to switch occupations is something like 5 or 6 times annual income. And the estimates that the World Bank's sticky feet report said they're even larger potentially in developing countries. So there's these incredibly large estimates of these adjustment costs. So I'm wondering, I mean, are you using those, or did you find others, or do you really, I mean, how are you thinking about these labor market transition costs?
I think you might have a better answer than me, but I could say that we really don't take enough, the tool does not give us enough information about transition costs. What we can certainly look at is the investments and the costs there, but we're not tracking the whole transition and all those costs that you're talking about, the nuances and so forth, because the costs then also involve how does the labor market itself react, the dynamics within the labor market. The tool is not allowing us to do that. So we do make quite a number of assumptions. It's a model after all, but certainly there would be costs that we haven't taken into consideration.
So this works, right? Okay, so in our work, essentially the only part that touches upon it is the second part of the two-way effect, where it shows that if we are to go quicker, then this will increase labor market transitions, right? And you have two ways this could go. So one is due to a quicker decarbonization. The other one is due to potentially these new technologies being more specialized, which it could be if we have to push for this kind of new technologies. Now, if you have data on the cost of this for particular workers, I would love to try and do a welfare analysis on this, because essentially what I would like to take this is to try and do a bit of a different cost analysis, because on the one hand, you have a carbon tax that kind of makes the transition faster, but this does not account for the fact on the workers that are affected. So if I could do that, then I would really like that, but I don't. So it's more like me asking you from now on, I guess.
Can I also say something about this? Well, these I thought a lot with my colleagues doing a computational general equilibrium model, how to build this transition cost, and actually is quite complicated because of course there are several components. When I show the results in terms of, you remember the STEM worker, how much they get in different positions, I show that they get less in the green jobs compared to other jobs. So there is a misallocation. So you have to consider then in these transition costs, you have to consider also the lost wages. But I think that the most straightforward way, is like a lower bound can be just to quantify the retraining required. And this you can do with ONET, actually, because in ONET you have the required on-the-job training. So the simplest way is to say how much is the gap to move worker, using this indicator. And I think this is a pretty accurate component. There are several components, but this is the component that should be the one that the public sector should take into consideration, should spend. Sorry? Yeah, of course, but this is I also think that this is the cost that the state should bear. The other costs are private costs at the end, So of course.
Fine. Yeah, if I may jump in here. Well, but the cost of the transition is endogenous to the policy. So I'm kind of reluctant to think that we estimate what is the cost of the transition for workers in Kentucky or Welsh valleys, and then we take that as a parameter that we should plug into the other models. Because if you have countries or past sort of like transitions where there was like no effort to mitigate that cost, you end up with a high number. You can just say, we impose that on the entire world. It's very high. It doesn't really make sense, but it's totally dependent on the past policy. So I would be reluctant to say that, yeah, that's a number like estimated for the US or the UK, just extrapolate for the entire, I don't know, OECD or even other countries. Even more so, it could be sort of like space specific, like location specific. I think it's very different when you have like, let's say, mining hub in Welsh valleys or Mpumalanga here, which is sort of like has very few other economic opportunities. It's going to be very different in, let's say, in Poland, where the mining hub is in the most industrialized region. So I would be kind of reluctant to say that it has to be high because it was high in some of the past transitions, to sum up.
So I was a little bit scared at looking at the list of jobs that are involved in green or brown, because to me, and correct me if I'm a bit biased here, they look all quite male-dominated jobs. And so I wanted to know, what is the future for women in the green economy? Is there? I know we don't have data, but I mean the the basis is a bit
The-
discouraging.
You're opening a very, 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 very big issues, and I didn't have we never put some data on this because actually it would be a separate paper. There is a nice paper of this young researcher from Birmingham University. She did something like this. It's exactly what you say. They are all male dominated, both green and brown jobs. So actually, and they are, because mostly there are also construction jobs, you know. And also you have to think, and this is a very nice point of the last presentation, what happened over time. So all these construction jobs will appear at the beginning and then they will disappear, you know. And so actually this will be, you know, the gender bias will be, you know, will be very big also over the transition. So actually, of course, this is something that, but we have to promote STEM education with the female. I think that's for sure very important. This we can do for sure.
So maybe I could also say one thing that this type of modeling can allow us is to prepare for the future, right? So we could bias the future training towards women. So produce more women managers, produce more, et cetera. How easy that is of course a question. Then we know how difficult that can be, but it's an opportunity to start to ask and answer some of these questions.
So I think that the first clue is indeed about STEM jobs, because STEM jobs, women are highly underrepresented. But I would also like to say that this might be even more boosted, that the fact that the second big transition that you have at the same time, automation, also acts in a similar way across gender. So it's not only the green transition, but it's the green transition and automation and the creation of new jobs at the same time that acts differentially across genders. So yeah, just a small comment.
So I think I cannot stand any longer between us and the aquarium and the dinner. And thank our speakers again, Francesco, Stefanos, and Margaret. Thank you so much for the 3 different perspectives on this important issue. Thanks all for sticking with us, and have a wonderful evening. Looking forward to seeing you over dinner.